thanks for joining this Brookbanks webinar on Comprehensive Coordination for Environmental Impact Assessments, or EIA. Delighted to be here today, and we'll start talking you through a little bit about us to start with, a refresher on EIA if you're not always dipping your toe into the waters of it, and then some top tips really from us around common pitfalls, what you need to do with getting your briefings right, and looking ahead at the environmental outcomes which we are going to be transitioning to at the end of 2027. I'm joined here today by my lovely colleague, Katherine. A bit about who we are. I won't regale this too much because hopefully people are aware of Brookbanks as a multidisciplinary consultancy, but just as a bit of intel to the sort of planning and EIA team and what we deal with in terms of the technical disciplines that feed into those processes. We really pride ourselves on being, a strong leadership team, having that agile ability to be pragmatic and work towards those positive planning outcomes, and really give a cradle to grave service offer. So this obviously fits neatly in the sort of earlier stage of the process of acquiring a site, getting that consent, and then looking through to delivery. But this is a bit about both of us. So yes, I'm Annabel Lohé. Nice to meet everyone here today, and thank you for joining. Just so you know, if you have questions as they arise through the webinar, please add them into the chat or the Q&A function, and then my colleague in the background is kindly collating them for us, and we'll pick them up at the end here. So I'm a planning associate director here with an EIA specialism. So we look after mostly residential-led schemes, but not exclusively, for generally sites in the big numbers, the 1,000 units plus, and working with a mixture of promoters, developers, joint ventures, including local authorities as well, to bring forward complex schemes and therefore coordinate the environmental impact assessment and that statement that's required. So my colleague Katherine, if you'd like to introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, so I'm Katherine and I sit within our Land Development and Communities team. I've been at Brookbanks now for over 8.5 years now. So our team itself looks at a variety of technical disciplines, including flood risk and drainage, highways, ground contamination, nutrients, and a couple of others as well. So I won't list them all. And we've been looking at the EIA technical chapters for, again, primarily residential developments, but not exclusively. I've been working on for the past 10 years, but they've been going on previously to that as well. So I'm here looking at the technical background for you.
Fantastic. So it'll be a bit of a tag team today between the two of us. Hopefully a good conversation to give you some food for thought while maybe munching on your lunch. So just a quick refresher. So environmental impact assessment accompanies the largest of schemes, as we said. It's really looking at the significant effects on the environment, and that is the key word there, significance, and that's the assessment you're making. And really, when those likely significant effects occur, what is the mitigations you're going to put in place to enable the decision maker to make a qualified judgment, not only on the planning balance that they may have to do, but also on these particular environmental effects and what you're putting in place to mitigate that in the future. And that's a combination of mitigation, isn't it, Katherine? I think we were talking earlier about there's different priorities and the types of mitigation people bring forward.
It is. So it's that what is national policy, what is local policy, what is just local requirements, what are planners' requirements, and what are planners' preferences and developers' preferences as well. So it's just that coordination of how everything is going to come together and the best way to present that for a specific planner, developer, and council.
Yeah, and it's about the mixture of embedded mitigation and also some of those more active mitigation measures, which obviously can be a different preference dependent on the scale of your scheme. So on that point, on scale of scheme and type of scheme, so we won't rehearse this too much, but the developments that require EIA are very specifically scheduled in the regulations. So I haven't regaled them all on this slide, but Schedule 1 developments, which are the most major infrastructure developments in this country. So some would be NSIPs, etc. Those are immediately requiring an EIA. So you don't screen those, you have to go straight to the scoping process. And then Schedule 2 developments is where you require the local planning authority to consider whether an EIA is needed or not through that screening process. These are probably the ones that we deal with the most here at Brookbanks because of the nature of the schemes we're involved in. And generally that's, industrial schemes above 0.5 hectares, or these termed urban development projects, which include schemes of over 150 dwellings. Obviously, that doesn't mean that these thresholds mean you always need an EIA. We work on a number of schemes where we've successfully screened it out. So this gives you a little flowchart there of how the process works, just as a refresher. But really, we want to delve into today some of the top tips about getting that briefing right as a coordinator, but also as someone receiving the briefing, like Katherine. So defining your scheme early. We understand that as you're building your master plan and understanding of the site and the constraints and opportunities, you might not understand quite the end goal when you're looking at screening or scoping. It can be something you want to get done early enough in the screening or scoping, so you've got time to do the relevant reports and baseline data, etc. But you need to understand what the scheme is to your consultants and give them the right briefing. So what we usually say is that if you're still in that period of flux, look at the worst case scenario. That's what some of the sort of Rochdale principles tell you to do when you're going to be submitting anything to the authority, because it's much easier to sort of scope things down later because the scheme has changed to be a bit more favourable. You're maybe not looking at quite as high a percentage of NDA for some reason. Then it is to increase that. You would potentially have to, rescreen or scope if you do that. So making sure that the consultant team, and frankly that everyone in the consultant team, knows each other properly and knows those interdependencies and what that scheme is. So I think as well, the planning context is very important in terms of the sensitivities that people are particularly alert to. What type of scheme is this? Is it something that's gone through the local plan process already? Is either an allocated site or an emerging allocation? And in which case there's maybe a strategic environmental assessment to already consider. That's quite clear to set out to your consultant team. Whilst they'll have their finger on the pulse about the specifics of the site, some of these, local plan documents and evidence bases are quite chunky, not always the easiest to navigate. And so really, as the role of a coordinator with a planning background, it's about sharing that with the appropriate teams, making sure any particular nuances are picked up earlier. Because if you're anticipating what your consultee is going to say to you, you're going to have a much smoother ride and be able to present it in a more effective manner. And where we then say about the purpose of the EIA. So obviously EIA has a set purpose in terms of what the MPBG says and that definition that was on the previous slide, and also the regulations. But the purpose for your client, what is the purpose of going through this process? Do they see it as a appeal strategy that likely the site is going to go through from a planning context, and therefore the sort of robustness and the scope of which the EIA needs to sort of lean towards, of the fact that you'll be potentially at an inquiry or something like that, and there's particular maybe Rule 6 parties or something that have a particular interest in an area of environmental impact. Again, you can steer it that way. They should always be robust. They should always be very clear, but about the level of kind of risk aversion with certain topic areas, it is something that will inform your scoping process. I think around scoping, Katherine, it's quite interesting when we were discussing about the types of assumptions you might need to make and those interdependencies. I don't know if you want to kind of weigh in on that.
Yes, so and again, it's one of those that when you're at that scoping and your screening stage, you have to remain flexible because, as Annabel went over, your master plan could change, your NDA changes, your land use changes. So it's that, what are your receptors? So from the technical side, you're looking at what are your receptors? Could those receptors change? Would the sensitivity of those receptors change based on your land use changes or your master planning requirements, or something that may come up from a local member of the public and or the council where you don't live in that area? There's always those quirks from local areas that you get picked up on, as well as soon as you've done the ground investigation works or traffic surveys, which Annabel was talking about earlier, getting those consultants to start talking to each other early, you know what everyone else is looking at and what receptors and what assumptions they're going to make, so that you're not contradicting yourself when you're at these early stages and you're trying to present your case to the councils.
Yeah, and I think one other thing is related to the sort of the cumulative impacts. What are you going to be looking at in terms of those additional sites, and alternatives, that you've had to consider? So I think giving that briefing really clearly to the consultant team, and agreeing the list of cumulative sites you're going to be working on through the scoping process, if you've had your EIA screened in, is really critical, because there's no real firm line you have to take in terms of kilometre distance, let's say, from a site to search for other sites coming forward to considering your cumulative assessment. There's probably general practice that people assume, but based on a locality, and the particular nature of that, and obviously the local authority will know that best, they'll probably have a view on if you need to broaden those boundaries beyond just a very simple radius. So I think that's a key point. So we're starting to stray into the next part, actually, which is the kind of common pitfalls here, aren't we? So yeah, I think one thing we wanted to talk about was, and this is how it can be a pitfall right from the screening stage as well, all the way through. If you're screening something and you have any inconsistency in your screening report around assumptions and that baseline data, you're way more likely to be scoped to have an EIA than not. I think when you're screening, you really need to say, what's the alternative? If you're going to screen out, you're going to say it's not going to breach that threshold effectively, where the officers would feel an EIA is required. What are they getting instead? How do they get that comfort? And that continues in the scoping process with particular topic areas. If you're suggesting, by example, which we've done fairly recently, to scope out ecology from the environmental statement, what are they having instead? A lot of the ecologists that we've been working with on the LPA side of things have found that actually an ecological impact assessment that's far more targeted, and is often confusingly known as an ECIA, which people sometimes abbreviate to EIA, is actually more targeted to their profession and their field. So they're sometimes quite comfortable to scope it out of the environmental statement if they're getting all the information they feel they need, to make a real qualified judgment, and representations into the planning process. So those assumptions as well, we do a lot of ES due diligence work as well, Katherine, in terms of these sites where we're working on a number which are sort of section 73, so variations to sort of older consents, or to not yet implemented schemes which need some work to become viable, for example. And the EIA work we've been doing on those has been looking at not necessarily unpicking other work streams from the past, but kind of where were some of those interdependencies just a little bit creaking. And I think some of the main ones we were talking about were the transport, and the assumptions and sensitivity analysis that have been previously done, and what has sort of changed over time. And you can't crystal ball gaze, but you've got to make some kind of phasing assumptions as well, which are often where things fall down. So I don't know if there's any you'd like to pick up on, I guess, with your particular sort of flood risk expertise, Katherine.
Yeah, so in terms of, for instance, the drainage or the nutrient side, which is a relatively new topic, the nutrients, but with drainage, you've got your latest SUDS guidance that came in July last year, which has impacted how you have to assess your basins and design your SUDS strategy, even at outline stage. So we're looking at more detailed information through the planning application earlier on, which all needs to be fed back through the EIA process. And then you've got other aspects, say for noise and air quality, you can't look at those disciplines until you've done the traffic modelling. You can't do the traffic modelling until you've done at certain times of year. So it's just that as time goes on, as national policy, legislation, requirements, even just the number of people living in an area, you might have done your initial EIA, so some of the ones that Annabel and I have looked at that are a few years old, new developments have popped up around those areas, therefore the traffic has increased in those areas. The types of drainage has improved in some areas and has been left in the older areas. So it's just picking up all of those individual areas, and just none of it was wrong in the past, it's just improved. It's in, everything's been updated, and you've just got to keep and making sure that whatever you're providing is future proofed as well. So it's good to, especially at the screening stages, just popping back to the screening and scoping, is just bearing that in mind and keeping your ideas flexible as well, and be open to change, I think, is the main thing as well. Don't be too stuck in, this is what we're scoping for now, this is our assessment of it, this is our assessment of it now, but you don't know what's coming on in the future. So we're going to keep flexible. The designs need to remain flexible. Our assessments need to remain flexible as the process continues.
Yeah, because as we know, and a lot of schemes in planning do take quite a considerable period to get through the process as well. So you may well be picking up addenda in the future to your environmental statement, which can be very targeted. You don't need to write the whole thing again, but you do need to consider those changes and keeping your finger on the pulse of them, being, a sort of positive reaction to what they are throwing up, and I think it's sort of forward forecasting that a little bit when you do your first ES, is what is like, even if you're saying, for example, we're talking about the true alternatives and cumulative effects. Yeah, you can't 100% know exactly when another application might be landing, but if there's been representations on something, even if it's not a true site that you can consider the cumulative effects of, because you've not got all the designs to fully understand, you can sort of forward forecast that should this arise in the time of consideration during the application, this is the methodology for which we would approach it. And you're giving the officers that confidence now about how to do it, and also you're mitigating your own risk, that you don't have to have that conversation opening up partway through the process. You can say, right, we anticipated this, we didn't need to factor it in then, we didn't have the intel, but now this is the methodology which will go down to revisit that, and that can therefore be a bit more streamlined. You can maybe have agreed with the officers in advance, certain things won't change if this site comes in, because it doesn't have these particular similar receptors, but that is the true sort of art of these things. And I think the true alternatives as well, just something on that, is exploring alternatives for the whole site. Could you actually have achieved this, maybe somewhere else? Why is this site the one that's coming forward, particularly in more speculative applications, but also alternatives for the specific design features? We were talking a little bit earlier, Katherine, about sort of SUDS, and that being the approach that is sort of put forward first, but in some instances that's not always the most effective for viability or other particular design reasons. You need to show that journey of the design evolution in that instance to prove you looked at the alternatives, why you discounted them, and why you've ended up with this particular result and the environmental effects of that result. DAS's design access statements are very good at showing that journey. Sometimes environmental statements haven't quite had that same approach in the past, but I think we do try and pride ourselves on doing that here at Brookbanks. So just looking forward a little bit, because appreciating we've got your time here today, and we'll leave a few minutes for questions. We're in this industry, we're now we've known for a bit of time, since the sort of Levelling Up and Regeneration Act was enacted, and the consultation that came out in 2023, that the government would like to see a move towards environmental outcome reports, which is a new way, effectively, of working through this similar process. The intent of this is to use the same structure of understanding those receptors and appreciating what the impacts could be, but you're looking at a very much outcome focused write-up. So you're looking at what is, okay, these are all your appended reports. We don't need to regurgitate them. We don't need to go over them with a likely significance of effects, because you've already considered that. But if you look cumulatively, maybe at biodiversity as a whole topic, and then you start to bring in the other technical disciplines that influence that, what is the environmental outcome that's being achieved, positive or negative, and what are the mitigations for that? So it's moving away from, a chapter on every single technical discipline towards an outcome that's affected by multiple disciplines and is considered more holistically. I think, for me, and this is my personal commentary, it's a good idea, because it could really help our industry, and there's been broad support, I think, from many of the bodies reflecting on this. But as we well know, there are often transitions that can be a bit bumpy in the road and can end up with you still doing quite a lot of extra work, and the standardization is really going to be key here, isn't it, Katherine? I think.
It is. We've got that they're coming up more and more often now. More and more sites are requiring an EIA. A lot more aspects are being able to be scoped out, as Annabel was discussing earlier, but on the ecology side of it, again, with drainage, you're kind of looking at scoping in all of the time because it is such a flexible discipline. But where it's going to be coming more and more common to put them together, that's streamlining the process of how we actually put the chapters together, because they are very bulky documents. As soon as you've got all of the chapters in, you've got all of your site summary, you've got all of your baseline conditions in, and a lot of that is repeated in your documents, especially where you've got crossover disciplines as well. So for drainage, we have a section on ecology, for instance, but the ecology are also talking about the drainage. It's just how can we slimline that process so that people aren't just reading two chapters that overlap and say similar things, as well as two reports as well, especially
Yeah.
if more and more are coming forward. More, you're going to have to read more of them and for longer periods of time.
So yeah, so the government now on the 13th of March this year, a little bit delayed, maybe about a year later than we expected, but they published their roadmap for moving towards these outcome reports instead of the traditional ES system, and the intent is for that to come into place by the end of next year, 2027, with consultation in the interim around those regulations, the guidance, and this testing and transition as well. So they've set out these three phases, which are similar to maybe how we've seen other particular disciplines come in into force before. Although, as we all know, things like BNG, for example, which was a very specific case, but took a lot longer than I think probably some people anticipated to get the calculator working in the way that it was necessary. And I can't remember exactly the revision number we ended up on now, but it was quite a process. So I think it would be fair to say that it's achievable, that by the end of 2027 we could be seeing this, but it's still ambitious, and the government still need to apply that focus, and with bodies such as ISAP and others getting involved to really pilot this in the way they expect, particularly in phase 3. So aware that we've got a few minutes left now, and I personally haven't seen the Q&A box at the moment, but I'll close my screen in a sec to have a look. But if there's any questions that pop into your mind now, then please do share them. We're happy to answer. Equally, if you go away from this and something occurs to you at any kind of time, our contact details are on here, and we're friendly, approachable people. Hopefully that's come across, and we're always happy to just have a conversation. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll
Thank
close
you.
there.